Hello and welcome to AMSA's webinar titled Gender-Based Violence and Harassment, Creating Safer Workplaces and Communities. My name is Sabrina Dimitra. I'm AMSA's Settlement and Integration Program Manager, and I will be facilitating today's webinar. Before we get started, I would like to thank Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada for funding today's event. The agenda for today's webinar is our first speaker is Ludmila Petrovic, who's my colleague here at AMSA. We are followed by Nino Can from Mosaic and Misha Dillon from EVA BC. Our final presenter will be Nina Kondo from Elmwood Community Resource Center. And just here with me today in the AMSA media room is our media specialist extraordinaire, Kana Raslan, as well as my colleague Ludmila, who will be presenting in a moment. And we will be having a Q&A session after all three presentations. But as mentioned before, please submit your questions throughout the event. So before we get started, we just wanted to find out a little bit more about you. And so we will just host a couple of polls. So our first poll is, what is the focus of your work in supporting newcomers? So I'll just give it one more second and we'll close it now. And so it looks like the majority of individuals work in the area of settlement and integration, followed by career and workplace development, followed by language training, and settlement workers in schools, a fourth, and research and policy, the final option. So thank you so much for participating in that poll. And so now our second poll is, we'd like to know in which region of British Columbia is your organization located. So if you could please select on one of the 5 regions to let us know from where you're joining us today. Perfect, thank you. So we'll just close that poll and thank you for your participation. So the majority of individuals are joining us from the Metro Vancouver region, followed by Fraser Valley, closely followed by Vancouver Island, Interior and North. So great to hear and see that we have a great spread across the province. So thank you to everyone for joining today's event. So I'm going to be handing it over in a moment to my colleague Ludmila Petrovic. But first I'd like to introduce Ludmila. Ludmila is a research and policy analyst at AMSA. Her role includes maintaining SettlementNet, knowledge mobilization, coordinating with community researchers, and developing migration matters info sheets. She is currently pursuing a master's in counseling psychology with a research focus on intergenerational trauma, gender-based violence, and diasporic identity. Her passion lies in social justice, anti-violence work, and mental health. So welcome, Ludmila, and please take it away.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. So my part of the presentation is predominantly going to be going over our recently released info sheet that is the same name as the webinar, and to set a bit of a foundation for other speakers with definitions and context. So the first thing that I want to define is on the next slide, gender-based violence. So this has often been called in the past violence against women, and gender-based violence is just a little bit more of an inclusive term. And it's any violence committed against someone based on their gender identity or gender expression or perceived gender. And it can take many forms, including sexual assault, intimate partner violence, which is also sometimes called domestic violence or family violence, and harassment. And no matter what form it takes, at its very foundation, gender-based violence is about power and control. So on the next slide, we're going to look at the power and control wheel, which is the Duluth model, which has often been used to show all of the different ways that power and control can manifest. So on the outside, you can see physical and sexual violence, and then inside the wheel, all of the different ways that this can manifest, including emotional abuse, isolation, intimidation, and on the left side, you'll see using male privilege. And I'm just going to say about that really can be any kind of privilege. And so on the next slide, we can see how it's been extended into different contexts to fit contexts such as the workplace, which we have right here. And you can see here all the different ways that this can manifest in the workplace. So we can see using employer privilege, using coworkers, using coercion and threats, And then it's also been extended for different demographics that have specific and unique barriers and needs. So on the next slide, we'll also see how it can affect immigrant women. So this model that we have right here, you'll probably see that it is US based. It refers to the United States, but really the dynamics are true no matter where. And we can see here that it's using citizenship or residency privilege, threatening to report or deport or withdraw a petition to legalize immigration status, isolation, so not allowing someone to learn the language, hiding or destroying passports or ID cards, things like that. So that's just to illustrate a little bit of how power and control, which is at the foundation of gender-based violence, how it can manifest in different contexts and with different demographics. And on the next slide, I'm just gonna go over some definitions, just so we're all on the same page. Sexual assault is any unwanted sexual contact that includes groping or coercion into sexual contact by use of force or abuse of power or authority. Harassment is any unwanted physical or verbal behavior. And it's, it can be unwelcome remarks, physical contact, threatening or intimidating behavior. And it's really a very broad term. It can be, harassment can be sexual or not. It can occur in any setting, and it can be perpetrated by a stranger, a coworker, a neighbor, even a friend or an acquaintance. But because of the unique context of the workplace, it comes with unique barriers and also with unique legal protections. So a lot of the info sheet is focused on the workplace. And then a subsection of harassment is sexual harassment, and that could look like unwanted sexual attention, coercion, or hostility. So things like misogynistic jokes or creating a hostile work environment. So next, we're going to talk about the social context. So what we know and what's been established in research as the context for this. And I will just say that a lot of the citations for this, where I got this information, it's in the info sheet if you're interested. So women are more likely than men to report experiencing workplace harassment in the last year. People with disabilities or members of a visible minority group are also more likely to experience harassment than other groups. And women that are in lower paying or less secure jobs or non-traditional careers that are maybe traditionally male dominated are some of the women most vulnerable to workplace harassment. And so we can see how this can affect the context of newcomer women who are quite often in lower paying or less secure jobs. And then over the past decade, many of the sexual harassment cases that were heard in that time in BC and Ontario human rights tribunals also pleaded discrimination based on other factors, such as race, ethnicity, place of origin, and related grounds alongside the sexual harassment. So what we can see here is that there really are a lot of intersections, and it's not just gender. There are other factors that play into this as well in making a certain individual particularly vulnerable. So that's why we need to take a look from an intersectional approach. So what is intersectionality? Intersectionality is, it was a term originally developed in 1989 by Kimberly Crenshaw to describe how Black women face discrimination based on both their race and gender. And she posited that these should not be treated as separate instances, but that the very intersection of those two are what makes women particularly vulnerable. And so since then, it's been expanded to look at how different aspects of a person's identity, including gender, race, ability, sexual orientation, immigration status, how all of these things can intersect to form a unique experience and unique vulnerabilities. So some of the impacts can be very, very deep, and gender-based violence can impact a survivor in all facets of life. So physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual, social, and financial impacts. And in terms of the workplace, even when the violence doesn't occur in the workplace, the effects run so deep that they can often seep into the workplace. And when it does happen in the workplace, it's a risk factor for poor psychological health, and sexual harassment in the workplace can impact the way that a survivor navigates the workplace. So they may not be attending work as often, and that might result in loss of income as well. And it might undermine their whole sense of dignity and competency and self. And women who experience workplace harassment also were more likely to report stress, poor mental and physical health, and were less hopeful for the future. So we can see how that's just, grazing the very top of all of the ways that gender-based violence can impact an individual. And so another thing is that it's very difficult for survivors to actually get help. So there's a lot of barriers to disclosing and reporting something like this. And so disclosing is telling someone what happened, and reporting is more formal. It might include a complaint to HR if it's in the workplace, or going to the police if it's a criminal situation. And a lot of the reasons are the same across the board for all gender-based violence. So, fear of repercussions, feelings of shame, self-blame, that's very, very common with survivors, power differentials. The reporting process and investigation can be very re-triggering and re-traumatizing for individuals, so many may not even want to go through the process. And the vast majority of workplace harassment cases are actually against a supervisor, manager, person of authority. So we can see again how the fear of repercussions could be very real in a situation like that. And then specific to newcomer women, some of the barriers that may be unique to this group are cultural norms around gender-based violence. So an individual may not know that it's even something to report. They may not even know that they can report. If it's occurred with another member in their community, they may not want to give their community a bad name or get that person in trouble. And they may, again, fear repercussions specifically around loss of income or immigration status. So for some, their immigration status or status of their partner or family may be linked to their job or a sponsor. And, whether or not it's true, they may fear that they may lose their immigration status or that it may impact their status. And newcomer women may also have language barriers. They may not know all of their rights in the workplace. They may not be aware of all of the services that are available to them. And they may also have less of a support system than, a Canadian-born woman or an established immigrant. So someone who has built a support system over the years. And the last thing that I will note is I mentioned earlier that there are unique legal protections when something happens in the workplace. So as we can see, the bottom two, harassment outside of the workplace and other forms of gender-based violence, such as sexual assault or intimate partner violence, fall under the Criminal Code of Canada. And harassment outside of the workplace there's a much higher bar for what is considered harassment criminally. And that, an example of criminal harassment would be something like stalking. So you wouldn't be able to necessarily get criminal charges in a situation where somebody is just giving you unwanted attention or sexual harassment. Whereas in the workplace, those things are considered workplace harassment, and there are provincial and federal legislation that protects you. So things such as the Canada Labour Code, the BC Human Rights Code, the Workers' Compensation Act, and the Occupational Health and Safety Regulations. So these are all things that protect employees from violence in the workplace. And there are further resources. As Sabrina mentioned, you can access the info sheet either on the webinars handout tab or on AMSA's website, and there are further resources there to supplement what I just talked about. Thank you.
Thank you, Ludmila. Thank you for providing a foundation for the rest of this webinar. I'd like to now introduce our next two speakers. Our first, who will be presenting in tandem, is Ninu Kang from Mosaic and Misha Dillon from the Ending Violence Association of BC, EVA BC. Ninu's academic background is in economics and counseling psychology. For over 20 years, she was involved in program development and managing client services at Mosaic. By delivering training across North America in the area of anti-violence and anti-racism, as well as through participating in international conferences, Ninu has been able to share her knowledge about the various cross-cultural models with which she is familiar with. So thank you, Ninu, for presenting. I'll be introducing your co-presenter, Misha Dillon, is the research and project coordinator at the Ending Violence Association of BC. In her role at EVA BC, Misha contributes her expertise to numerous projects and initiatives aimed at preventing and improving responses to gender-based violence, including community-based research and the development of training and resources for the anti-violence, health, justice, education, corporate, and settlement sectors. So I would like to welcome you to and thank you for presenting.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Thank you so much for that introduction, Sabrina.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be with all of you, especially those of you up in the north. I'm assuming it's colder than it is here, but in Vancouver we have a bit of the sun out, so
Still pretty chilly.
Yeah, chilly but sunny. So we're enjoying any last minute of the sun that we still get. So thank you so much for having us here, and we're going to really build on Ludmila's presentation, and thank you so much for setting the context. So I'm going to hand it over to Misha to do a bit of an introduction.
Sure. So this is Misha Dillon. Good morning, everyone. So I just wanted to start by giving a really brief overview of the Creating Safer Workplaces and Communities project that really is what spurned a lot of the work that our organization has been doing on this topic. So this is a project of the Ending Violence Association of BC, EVA BC, and it's funded by the Government of Canada's Department for Women and Gender Equality, which was formerly Status of Women Canada. And the project has focused on enhancing workplace responses to gender-based violence and harassment through collaboration with 3 different sectors. So we've worked with Indigenous workplaces and communities, and that work's been led by Chastity Davis. We've been working with corporate systems and institutions led by EVA BC's Executive Director, Tracy Porteous. And we're also working with immigrant and refugee serving organizations, and this work has been led by Ninu Kang, and I'm very glad to have her co-presenting with me today. So through this work, we've developed a set of workplace policy guidelines that's quite extensive, has a lot of great legal information in it. We'll be sharing that with you all following the session. And additionally, we've developed some training curricula. So today we'll be sharing an adapted portion of those trainings. Okay, so just to quickly go over our agenda for this morning, and as Ninu said, going into a bit more depth on some of the topics that Ludmila gave that really helpful overview of. So we're going to quickly go through gender-based violence and harassment. We'll discuss some of the ways in which it may show up in the workplace, the impacts on those directly involved, as well as their workplaces and communities, disclosing and reporting violence and harassment, and how to support somebody who may disclose to you, as well as some strategies for how your workplaces can better respond to violence and harassment. And so now I will pass it over to Ninu.
Great, thank you, Misha. As mentioned earlier, gender-based violence and harassment, really just to understand the definition, it's a form of violence that's committed against someone based on their gender identity, their gender expression, or perceived gender. This is a definition that has been adopted in a report from then called Status of Women Canada in 2018, but now it's Women and Gender Equality Ministry federal level. And again, the main areas that we want to look at is sexual assault, sexual harassment, intimate partner violence, again, sometimes called domestic violence, and bullying and personal harassment. And so again, as said earlier, gender-based violence can appear in and impact the workplace in many ways. We're going to talk a little bit about how some of these appear in our workplace. Again, I'm going to go through these fairly quickly because I think Ludmila had covered them so nicely. So sexual violence, an umbrella term, as we talked about it, it's non-consensual sexual contact or behavior. And sexual assault, any form of activity that is imposed and forced upon someone without their consent. And I think this sexual assault is a really important one for us to think about. And we're going to talk a little bit about statistics on people reporting. But really in this, the key element to consider is consent. And so as you know, there's a lot of things in the media with regards to the Me Too movement and things like that. And there's a lot of conversations and discourse around, well, you know, a lot of victim blaming and people sort of having these conversations. Well, when is someone consents and when they withdraw consent, what this means. And I think what we want to say about sexual assault is consent is everything. That someone that is where any sexual activity is imposed or forced upon, it could be consensual at some point, but any one of us has the right to withdraw consent at any time. So that's a really key component of that. Sexual harassment, again, very quickly, as said earlier, it's repeatedly saying or doing something related to gender, sex, and is insulting or offensive. And of course, we talked about that it can be more than just gender. It's the intersectionality, and we'll get into that a bit more. Intimate partner violence, again, domestic violence. And I think it's been said very well that this is so embedded in power and control. And there's a whole different webinar we could do on intimate partner violence. And the only thing I want to say is many of you have programs actually in your organization where you respond to clients on intimate partner violence. So you know, there's a big element of power and control in here, and I think that's been covered nicely earlier. This is a pyramid. Is just very quickly I want to highlight that if you look at the base of it, a lot of these issues start with attitudes and beliefs. So things like ageism, ableism, body shaming, colonialism, classism, and so on and so forth. So in other words, this is very much embedded in attitudes and values. And why this is important for us to notice as we talk about a workplace, all of us should be really looking at the culture of our workplace. What are the attitudes and beliefs that exist on our workplace that will then help us start to understand how this issue around workplace harassment, sexual harassment, and bullying can be addressed. If we don't address it at that bottom pyramid, really you're looking at things escalating, and then it gets into sexual harassment, criminal harassment, threats, bullying, and so on. And then again, if we as organizations don't address it appropriately in that middle pyramid, then what you can see is you can see more sexual assaults and physical assaults. And then of course, in the discourse of looking at violence, we know that these things can lead to homicide. And again, this slide, just very quickly, what this slide is really showing is that we have, you know, 47% of the Canadian workplace is women. So this impacts women predominantly, and so all of us in our workplace has a big role to play in making sure that all our workers are safe. Intersectionality, again, this has been covered a little bit. You can see that this slide we have here, it looks at intersectionality from various other lenses other than gender, and that from race, ethnicity, religion, age, and so on. So it's just a little bit of a visual to demonstrate what Ludmila had shared with us earlier. And of course, I'm repeating the fact that people of color people with disabilities, LGBTQ people, Indigenous people, and other marginalized group, people who are in poverty and so on, they do experience more violence and harassment than other groups. So we want to move now to the, I'll give that to you.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to speak a little bit about how these things impact the workplace and how they show up at work. So as we've discussed, it's not uncommon for gender-based violence and harassment to both occur within the workplace or have impacts on the workplace. And of course, violence and harassment are going to impact and affect the people that are directly involved, whether that's the person who's been harmed, the person who caused the harm, or someone who might be witnessing that. But these impacts also often extend into their communities, including the workplace community, which is going to be a big focus of what we're talking about today. So generally speaking, I wanted to discuss a few of the main ways that gender-based violence and harassment might show up. So it may occur within the workplace itself. Employees may experience violence or harassment that's perpetrated by someone they work with, so a coworker, a supervisor, an employer. And the person who is violent or harassing an employee might also be a client or the family member or partner of a client. Sexual assault also happens in the workplace. Almost 1/3 of Canadian women report experiencing non-consensual sexual touching in their workplace. And intimate partner violence and abuse may also take place in the workplace. For example, if both partners are employed in the same place. And as Ludmila touched on earlier, one of the most common examples of it occurring within the workplace is sexual harassment. So here we have a few statistics. Over half of Canadian women have experienced workplace sexual harassment, which is a shocking number, maybe not so shocking, but large. And we also know that this is experienced by many trans and gender nonconforming employees. As you can imagine, there hasn't been the depth of research that we would hope, but when thinking about gender-based violence, it's really important to keep in mind that it's not just about women, it's also about other marginalized gender identities. And this also impacts how employees do their work. So again, looking at women, almost 90% say they actively do things to avoid unwanted sexual advances in the workplace. So this might mean avoiding certain people with a reputation for inappropriate behavior. Some might avoid socializing with their colleagues in general. And as you can imagine, this does end up having workplace impacts and career impacts. So next, violence and harassment outside of the workplace can also have impacts within the workplace. For employees that experience violence or harassment outside of work, it can cause trauma that impacts all aspects of their lives, including at work. For example, we know that 1/4 of people who've been sexually assaulted experience difficulty carrying out everyday activities. And this may cause them to miss work, decrease their productivity, lead to concerns about job security, lead to difficulty maintaining employment. So Nina will be talking a little bit more about the impacts of trauma in a few minutes. Intimate partner violence is also a way that impacts can be seen within the workplace. It's often seen as taking place in the home, but when people come to work, the violence and abuse often comes with them in one way or another. So a victim or survivor of intimate partner violence may skip work due to bruises or injuries. They might not be able to get to work if their partner limits their access to transportation or their childcare plans. And they may have their work interrupted by an abusive partner frequently checking in by phone or text. These are just a few examples. And of course, this also impacts the workplace of the abusive partner. So the abusive partner may use work time or resources to perpetrate violence or abuse. And we also know that in rare instances, intimate partner violence can actually pose a safety concern to others in the workplace. So for example, if an abusive partner shows up to threaten or to cause harm. And so just some statistics to demonstrate this as well. For victims and survivors of intimate partner violence, over half said that violence continued at work. And some examples of how this continued was through abusive phone calls and text messages, through stalking, which is also called criminal harassment, or the abusive partner physically coming into the workplace. And the statistic on the bottom also shows the impacts on the abusive partner's work, with almost half of abusive partners saying that issues related to the violence often negatively affected their job performance. And Thirdly, another way violence and harassment may show up in your workplace is through the experiences of the clients you're serving. So as we discussed earlier, gender-based violence is really quite prevalent in Canada and in most countries, unfortunately. And we know that people who experience social marginalization and discrimination are at a greater risk of gender-based violence and harassment. So it follows that it's really quite likely that you will work with clients who have experienced gender-based violence or harassment, and in some cases, a client may disclose to you that they've experienced this. So in a few minutes, I'm going to take you through some basic tools for responding to a disclosure and helping folks access supports. But first, I'm going to pass it back over to Minu, who will talk a bit more about the impacts of gender-based violence and harassment.
Thanks, Misha. So, you know, this slide we put up here is really to demonstrate that the severity of violence and harassment that we have doesn't determine, the severity of violence and harassment doesn't determine the severity of impact. So, for example, every single one of us experiences trauma in a different way. One thing I guess is something that's new in this field of anti-violence work, and that is our understanding of how trauma relates to our body and our brain. So there's a fair bit of work that's been done on it, and one of the things that we've learned more recently is that anyone that experiences forms of violence experiences trauma, but not every single individual experiences it in the same way, because it's based on our previous experience, it's based on multiple forms of trauma. So as individuals who are trying to figure out how to support someone that has been impacted by it, it really is case by case. So what this slide shows is that there's these different elements. It impacts us spiritually, behavioral, emotional, psychological, interpersonal, and physical. So as Misha shared with you earlier, what we want to talk about is how it can show up in different ways based on a person's individual experience. So the person who's been harmed may feel distracted, tired, forgetful. So, you know, you may see signs of this person sort of what we, you know, their normal everyday behavior. You might start to see some changes. So just to keep an eye on that. There might be experienced physical, mental health impacts. As said earlier, people may be missing work and things like that. Self-isolation from co-workers, just some easiness. Again, we may not know why, but we start to observe this with our co-workers or our subordinates or maybe our superiors. There might be canceled meetings, presentations, be late, miss work, consistently text or check their phones, and that might be where someone may be experiencing power and control in their intimate relationships, and which is spilling over at work. You know, time breaks to avoid a person who's caused harm, and again, that's just where we're starting to see someone protecting themselves, and you're starting to see that, you know, they may be not ready to come and share that with anybody. Arrive early, leave late, those kinds of things. Avoid working alone. So, you know, you may start to get hints, the fact that something is going on in this person's life. The other thing, again, this impacts workplace. So co-workers and supervisors are also impacted. You know, you may become concerned about the person who's experienced violence, harassment, but you may think it's none of my business. How, you know, is the person comfortable enough to me approaching them? You may not know how to deal with it. And you may not know how to help. And also need to take, you may need to take on extra work because the person is perhaps not showing up. So you may even feel a little bit frustrated, but at the same time, you may also feel helpless in figuring out how to support. You may experience challenges in their work relationships, show that there's, you know, decreased productivity. There might be meetings, projects, proposals that need to be written. All of a sudden, someone experiencing that really may have a setback on your whole team in terms of the work that you're trying to do. Again, become, after seeing patterns of relationship abuse repeated, fear of their own safety. Workers might feel, as Misha said, somebody showing up at workplace, not knowing how to help and support. And you may need to make accommodations to support the victim or the survivor. And of course, you may also need to think about how to put in some supports or some information and education to someone that might be also causing the harm. And now this is sort of the last slide in my section here. And what really this talks about is that, you know, workplace harassment, sexual harassment, and bullying, it impacts the whole community. It impacts our work and workplace. And so it's really important that workplace response is predetermined. We have policies and procedures in place. We build a culture of safety where workers feel safe to come out. And then we also, the second piece is, how do we support an incident that comes forward? How is the workplace equipped to handle that? And how do they handle it? What message does it give to other workers? That is their workplace safe enough for them to come out as well? You know, these things will travel through the grapevine in the organization. So an incident dealt well will have a positive impact in the organization culture, and something that isn't dealt well with by the organization will have a negative impact. And of course, we also need to do community education, ongoing education, to do prevention of this at workplace. So I'm going to hand it over to Misha.
Thank you, Ninu. So in this next section, keeping in mind all of those impacts, we'll discuss some of the barriers that exist to someone sharing their experiences of gender-based violence or harassment, and also go through some key strategies for responding if someone does disclose to you. So as Ludmila mentioned, there is a distinction between disclosure and a report, and we just wanted to take a quick second to clarify that difference. So disclosing simply means telling someone about what happened, and this could be a friend, a family member, a coworker, a counselor, a settlement worker. And there's many reasons why someone may choose to disclose. They may need emotional support, they may want to access support services, or they may need some sort of accommodation. And within the workplace, for example, this may mean they need time off to attend appointments related to the violence. So for perhaps with a counselor or with the police. And in contrast to that, reporting involves making an official or formal complaint to authorities. So this would be reporting to the police, but could also include reporting to your workplace, such as to human resources. And the key piece here is that usually reporting will begin some sort of formal process. So when you report to police, it'll generally result in an investigation. And within the workplace, the process that is instigated will depend on your workplace's policy and procedures, but it may include an investigation, access to specific counseling supports, or some sort of specific leave, which may be sick leave or disability leave. And I don't know if you've all have heard recently, but the BC government is looking into options for providing leave to survivors of intimate partner violence and sexual assault as well. And some workplaces are already doing that, I know. So of course, if you do experience violence or harassment, it can be really difficult to tell anyone. We know there's many reasons why people may be reluctant to disclose or report what happened to them. Ludmila went over a few of those earlier. I have a few more examples here, but rest assured there are endless reasons. So someone who'd experienced violence or harassment may be concerned about confidentiality and want to avoid their coworkers gossiping about what happened or excluding them. They may work closely with the person who harmed them, which may make them unsure about getting that person in trouble. They may worry about it impacting their career. So for example, if their manager sees them as less capable or someone who's causing issues. They may be concerned about their legal status, especially if that legal status is tied to the status of an abusive partner. They may face discrimination embedded within response systems. So for example, racist or sexist responses from police, whether their own responses or responses that others have received that have been discouraging. They may lack awareness of their legal rights, and this is especially relevant to newcomers in Canada. They may believe the workplace response won't be sufficient, and this is especially true if their workplace doesn't have policy or procedures already in place, which is another key reason to do that proactively. They may face some language barriers, and they may also lack access to culturally safe resources. So, for example, resources that work to address violence while still respecting collectivist cultural values in some cases. So in Canada, we know that many people who've experienced gender-based violence don't report to police. As you can see on the screen here, 5% of sexual assaults are reported to police, and less than half of intimate partner violence is reported to police. And in the workplace, it's important to remember that some of the barriers that keep people from reporting to police are also going to keep people from reporting to their workplace. So we do know that rather than making a formal report, it's likely that someone who's experiencing violence or harassment will disclose informally, often telling a coworker or a supervisor. And clients may also see you as a safe person to disclose to. So with that in mind, we did want to dedicate a decent portion of our presentation today to talking about how to respond to a disclosure of violence or harassment. So as I mentioned, this disclosure may come from a coworker, a client, or someone else in your life. It's really common if this happens to feel uncertain about what to do, but you don't need to be an expert to respond to a disclosure. So your key role here is to support them through the process of disclosing and help them access any additional supports and services that they may need, whether that's within the workplace or outside of the workplace. And while workplaces do have certain roles and responsibilities, we recommend as a first step responding to a disclosure by following these 3 key principles. So listening attentively, believing what's being shared with you, and supporting them in moving forward with next steps. So the first piece is listening actively, which involves making eye contact, ensuring that you're having that conversation in a private space, avoiding distractions or interruptions. And while you're listening, it's key to be patient. So let them tell you as much or as little as they want at their own pace without interrupting them. And mirror the language that they use, especially when describing what happened. It can be really upsetting if you label or name their experience for them. For example, if they tell you about a bad sexual experience and you respond, oh, it sounds like that was sexual assault, it can be really jarring. So using the language, reflecting the language that they use is the best way to provide support as they're telling you about what happened. You should also avoid asking for unnecessary details, which can often be overwhelming or re-traumatizing. So if you do find yourself wanting to ask about any details, it's good to think about the specific purpose of why you're asking. And if you don't need to know, it's usually best not to ask. And in listening, you also need to ensure that you're respecting their personal space. A lot of us are quite physically affectionate people, and your instinct might be to comfort them with a hug or a hand on the arm. And this is especially true if it's, you know, a coworker, someone you have a personal relationship with. But it's important to remember that when someone has experienced harassment or violence, they may not want to be touched, and you should really follow their lead here. And they'll tell you what they need from you. And lastly, in this piece, it's important not to overreact to what they're telling you. So, of course, it may be really hard to hear what happened, but reacting with judgment or shock isn't going to be reassuring to the person disclosing to you, and it may lead to an unnecessary focus on your emotional responses. So in a situation where they're trying to comfort you or reassure you rather than focusing on their own disclosure. That said, if you are upset by the conversation, which I think folks often will be, you can consider debriefing with someone else for support following that conversation, of course, without sharing any confidential details. This next piece is focused on believing what they're sharing with you and demonstrating that you believe them. So it's really important and crucial to not minimize or question the truth of their story. Your role at this time is not to determine exactly what happened or what action should be taken next. Your role here is to listen and to trust what they're saying to you. You should reassure them that what happened was not their fault, and this is especially important because many people who experience violence or harassment do struggle with blaming themselves. I'm sure you've heard the term victim blaming before. This is really common in regards to sexual violence, but all sorts of violence. There's questions of, oh, what did you do? What could you have done differently? You should also validate and normalize their experiences and their responses to it. So making sure they know that what they're feeling and experiencing is understandable and a common reaction to the trauma that they've gone through. And lastly, reassure them that you'll do whatever you can to help them get the support they need. especially because this first disclosure might be really difficult. It might be the first time they're telling anyone, and so having that reassurance that there's someone there to support them with next steps can be really helpful. And that brings us to the final key piece of responding. So this last piece focuses on ensuring that they are getting the support they need moving forward. Discussing their options for next steps is also a really important way you can help them regain a sense of power or control, which is something that's often taken away from people who have experienced violence or harassment. So having them make choices about what they want to do next can give them a bit of that control back. Any immediate needs should be addressed first. For someone experiencing intimate partner violence, this may involve a safety plan for themselves and perhaps for the office as well, depending on the situation. And someone may also need immediate workplace accommodations. So for example, changing work tasks or who they report to so they aren't working directly with someone who has harmed them. You can also help them in identifying existing supports like family, friends, or counselors, and help them connect with those supports. And lastly, you can refer them to resources for specialized support, whether that's a resource within the workplace or through a community-based anti-violence service. And these resources can give them information about their options and help them navigate whatever options they may choose. So this graphic just highlights some of the options for next steps depending on the nature of the violence or harassment. This may include medical options like getting medical assistance for specific injuries or a forensic medical exam to gather evidence. And it also includes legal options like reporting to police, making a human rights complaint, or getting a protection order. And so I'm not going to go into depth with this here, but you can find a lot more information about these options through the policy guidelines document, which I'll be sharing following the webinar. And also recognizing that this is a little overwhelming to navigate, just a reminder that community-based anti-violence services really are equipped to provide information and help people navigate these options. So they're really good first referral to get all the support that they might need. I'm going to pass it back to Ninu to speak to workplace response.
Sure, thank you, Misha. So again, just to bring our presentation to a close, sort of at a high level, there are three sort of key principles to workplace response. It has to be trauma informed, and it has to be victim and survivor centered, and culturally safe. So again, what I want to say about trauma informed is that really recognizing that experiencing gender-based violence can be traumatic and often has a long-lasting effect. And as well, it could be multiple forms of trauma or re-traumatization of people. So, you know, when we respond to that, really need to understand that and make sure that we have appropriate resources and supports, as Misha has said, in place. The other is that we want to make sure that our respond, whatever our policies and our practices respond that we have in the organization, is really prioritize the rights and needs of the victim and the survivor. So again, that's a really, and make sure that we're not creating further harm. And research also shows that those individuals that are harmed and the first person or first resource that they reach out to, if that is a supportive resource, then they actually make their way through to the healing. But if they experience, whether it's police or whoever the first responder or the first person that they tell, if that's a negative experience, it's possible that they'll just go back into their shell and start doing further self-blaming and so on. So the last culturally safe one, again, as we sort of shared this with you earlier, it's really important for us to recognize that within our organization, we have individuals, different class, group, culture, and all of that, that we really create a response that is culturally sensitive and appropriate. Again, just I've got, I think, 3 slides left, and this one is really consideration for mitigating risk. Again, we want to make sure that if we can, as an organization, we can create a culture of prevention and a culture that demonstrates that we're not tolerating these kinds of attitudes and behaviors, then that's really what we're wanting to promote. So everyone in the workplace has rights. That's something we want to make sure that we put in place. Awareness of bias and capacity. We ourselves as organizations, we, as many staff as we have, that's how many personalities and personal experiences that we have. But it's really important that we create a culture where we're all being aware of our own biases. Consider liability to the organization. There's union representation in some organization. You want to make sure that you look at how your policies and procedures are interacting with your union. Make sure that they're involved. Communication and procedural fairness. Again, the key thing is consider survivor safety and make sure that you put in interim measures in place. We want to look at some key considerations for conducting trauma-informed workplace investigation. And again, we're going to provide you with some resources and support, which will have a lot more detail, how you can actually, the ABCs of this, how you can walk through this. But again, we talked about having a safer space for the interviews. And again, survivor-centered approach is and also no harm, and making sure that the approach is the beginning to the end. So understand impacts of trauma and potential triggers. I think the last thing we want to say, which is that there are community-based anti-violence organizations in your community. Like I said earlier, you may even have programs in your own organizations that you may tap into to give you some more resources. There's workers' rights resources, legal supports, online resources and guides, and your colleagues within the sector. But again, we are going to provide you with our policy guideline. That's what I want to say.
And I just wanted to pop in and mention that in this workplace policy guidelines document, we also have a really extensive resource list that offers resources that are relevant to specific roles within the workplace, as well as specific communities in general.
The only other thing I want to say in this is that you talk about workplace policy. We want to acknowledge that many of you have policies. Many of you have worked through, perhaps you have one or multiple policies, that this really, the guide that we're providing you is to help you look at what you have existing and integrate some of these guidelines that we're proposing to you. And you may need to redo policies, you may need to collapse them or pull them apart, but we are recommending that you have a separate gender-based violence and harassment bullying policy at your workplace. Again, this is our last slide, and it really just talks about having a culture that is a safe workplace culture. So creating a positive, respectful workplace requires the understanding and commitment of all parties. But in particular, it really requires the leadership of the organization to buy into this. And I think once you have that at a leadership level, you'll see how it permeates through the organization. And that is our last slide. So thank you very much, everybody. Misha, do you want to say anything about sort of final words?
Just thank you as well for joining us. Up on the screen, I've provided my email address. Should anyone want to get in touch with me, I'm sure you can also contact AMSA and they can pass along anything. And on the right, just recognizing that this is a difficult topic, and it's possible that there's folks attending today that may have some emotional responses. I did just want to share these support services here. Should you want to access them, Victim Link BC is a really good one-stop resource, their provincial resource that can provide information and connect folks with local community-based anti-violence organizations. You can also go on the Anti-Violence Association of BC's website in our Need Help section, and there's also WorkSafe BC crisis support line. So just wanted to give you these 3 key resources should you need to access them in the next little bit, and a reminder that there's more resources in the document we'll be sharing.
Thank you, and we'll be open for
yes,
the question
look
period.
forward to your questions later. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ninu and Misha, and thank you for sharing. And all the documents and the policy guidelines that were mentioned, as well as the handout and the PowerPoint slides, they will be shared out with everyone following the presentation. So I would just like to introduce our final speaker of the day, Nina Kondu. Nina is the Executive Director of Elmwood Community Resource Center, which is a community-based organization offering various services to families living in Elmwood for the past 18 years. As well, Nina serves on the board of directors for the Manitoba Association of Newcomers Serving Organizations, MANSO, and we're very glad to have you with us today, Nina.
Thank you, Sabrina. So I will be presenting on a new initiative that was funded by Immigration, Refugee Citizenship Canada through YMCA BC. The initiative is to bring various sectors to develop a gender-based national strategy for gender-based prevention for working with newcomers and refugee families. So I am involved as a representative from MANSO, Manitoba, as a board of MANSO, and MANSO was asked to sit and represent the Canadian Immigrant Settlement Sector Alliance, CISA-ACSI. And as CISA-ACSI is an umbrella organization and has membership, so next slide. The members of CISA include MANSO, so Manitoba Association of Newcomer Serving Organization, here in Winnipeg and Manitoba, and the other members are Saskatchewan Association of Immigrant Settlement and Integration Agency in Saskatchewan, as well as AMSA, the Affiliation Multicultural Society and Services Agency, and Alberta Association of Immigrant Serving Agency, Atlantic Region Association of Immigrant, and the last one is Multicultural Center of Yukon. So those agencies are under the umbrella of CISA-ACSI as a main umbrella organization. So I am speaking as a representation of CISA-ACSI, representing all those members. So the purpose of the coalition was to come and bring settlement and anti-violence organization to work together in developing gender-based violence response for newcomer community. So by establishing a common base knowledge and resources training, developing standardized gender-based violence practices and response and protocol for settlement sector, but as well as the anti-violence sector to understand how to work with settlement sector in a collaboration ways that we support newcomer families. So the objective of the coalition is to have the settlement and anti-violence sector work together, developing the standardized settlement agency GBV procedure, and finding ways to develop protocol using a safety lens to support service users, but also to increase capacity of settlement workers as well while they're providing services. Develop a series of webinars establishing a common base of what's GBV, and develop a standardized curriculum or a training prevention programming model for service users or for clients. So in April, this coalition came together in April, having 4 organizations, including settlement sector and anti-violence sector, coming together and developing knowledge and where we want to go and how do we want to work together in creating this gender-based violence settlement sector strategy. And we, as 4 agencies, so that include CISA-ACSI, EVA Canada, and YMCA and OCASI from Ontario. We came together, and as working together, we are developing a guiding principle from working from a trauma response, developing place-based approach, where when we are developing this strategy, we're keeping that at the forefront of our mind, developing a collaboration between the organization and fostering positive relationship between the settlement sector and anti-violence sector, having those open dialogue and coming up with strategies that will be impactful, but also will be usable within the sectors. We're also looking at one of our principles is also building capacity within these organizations, and looking at inclusion. So working from an inclusion practice. We're hoping to have by this fall, so a needs assessment survey has started to go out to some sector, to some region. We're hoping to send that out across Canada. So both settlement sectors and anti-violence sectors can participate in the survey, and asking, the survey is asking what are your knowledge, what are the resources you're accessing in terms of accessing supporting gender-based violence, families that are experiencing violence, and what other resources that are missing, whether it's a policy or whether it's frontline work, trainings, capacity building. And then we're hoping by winter 2020, we will be able to draft a client gender-based violence prevention programming curriculum, having a summary of the needs assessment, and perhaps roll out the beginning of standard protocol and procedure tools, and maybe starting to also drafting webinar into how to facilitate or how to implement gender-based violence programming and safety within your services. And by next spring 2020, we will be able to have maybe a rollout of a second webinar of introduction and safety around gender-based violence work. And following that, we'll have developing 4 webinar for an online training for service providers, settlement sectors, but also establishing champion network, while developing an additional communication plan for online training promotion for settlement sector and anti-violence sector, to work together and looking at what's missing and how can we fill the gaps in responding to gender-based violence for newcomer and refugee families. And finally, finalizing the coalition work. So it will be until 2021. That's when we will end the strategy. And we're hoping through that we will be able to share, through the survey, people will be able to share what are the gaps, what are the needs that are missing, but also a little bit going deeper, looking at when we talk about newcomer, it's really broad word, and gender-based violence manifests in different ways, whether it's through culture, through religion. So looking at all of those intrinsic layers of gender-based violence that may manifest for a newcomer family that we may not see, and how do we implement those, and how do we create that sense of safety, but also creating procedures that will be responding to best practices in responding to gender-based violence. So that's the somewhat my presentation. And if you have any question or you need more information, please feel free to contact YMCA or myself if you have questions, and then I will stay online for any additional questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Nina. Thank you for sharing the work that is happening nationally, and thank you for being part of that. We look forward to receiving continuous updates from you on that. So we just want to move over to, we have a few minutes left for some questions. And so you're able to submit your questions using the question box, tweet us using hashtag AMSA events, or you can email your questions to jship@amsa.org. And our first question that we're going to have is for Misha and Ninu. And it's in regards to disclosing. So when somebody discloses, how do you decide when and if it should be taken to the next reporting stage. Obviously, the victim must be willing, but what if the victim is unwilling or in shock to make that decision? Who decides in that situation what the next step should be? And if you could expand a little bit more what somebody should do once somebody has disclosed something to them and what those next steps should be.
Sure, absolutely. This is Misha speaking. So our core approach would be that any decisions about what happens next should be made by the survivor, made by the person disclosing. It really isn't optimal to have other folks making those decisions on their behalf, even if they're not ready. We really do recommend that workplaces not have a mandated reporting policy. So to make it possible for folks to disclose without it leading to a formal report. This is because it can have unintended negative consequences for the person who was harmed, and it also can discourage people who are harmed from coming forward if they know, if I tell someone about what happened, well, it automatically has to go to the next level. That said, there are, of course, going to be workplace policies and procedures that would probably ultimately determine your next steps there. And there are also some limits to confidentiality. So some cases in which you are expected to share that knowledge, it's best to probably check in with the legal experts in our guidelines around the details of that. But essentially, if there's imminent harm to that person or to others, or if a child is in danger. But ultimately, whenever possible, it should be the choice of the person who's disclosing what happens next with that information.
And may I just underscore that? And one thing we also know from research in this sector is that individuals who've been harmed, and in many cases, my work experience has been primarily with women who've been harmed, the first step is to tell someone. And there's actually research that shows, and this is in intimate partner violence, domestic violence situations, that individuals experience on average forms of violence, 14 incidences of violence before they actually come and report. And even when they do disclose to somebody, even when they disclose, they may disclose to a number of people before they're ready to actually make the decision, because they know that this could impact, I'm talking about intimate partner violence, for example. It'll impact their children, it'll impact perhaps their financial situation. There might be further violence from the partner. So if you take those same principles and apply them to our workplaces, then again, the person that's sharing first time with somebody isn't ready to take any action. And we really need to respect that. And of course, there will be the exceptions to the confidentiality that Misha talked about. And you want to really lay those out in the policies really clearly. And then after, you want to do education in your workplace to make that really clear and really help your staff in taking disclosures, or and then what the staff's role will be. So this is the education part that needs to go along with the policy. Hope that's helpful.
And maybe I'll just add one final thing, which is just that if there are systems in place where if someone does disclose, then that information has to be shared with this certain person. If there's a procedure in place that needs to be followed within the workplace, it's important that the person who's experienced violence or harassment is really clear on that process. The worst thing would be them going in thinking that they can have a confidential conversation and then realizing that what happens next is actually out of their hands. So if you do have a workplace policy or procedure that requires reporting to the next level, even if the survivor doesn't want it, it's really important that that's made clear so that they have the choice to not disclose in that case.
Okay,
I hope that helps answer. Thank you.
Yes, it does. Thank you so much. We have time for one final question. This one again is for Ninu and Misha. When a newcomer gets a new job, are there services available to support them with better understanding the workplace harassment policies? Often starting a new job is daunting, and the language in these documents can be intimidating. Are there any services or referrals that you know of?
That's a good question. And of course, we're speaking to individuals across the province. And so we'll really want to acknowledge that there's different resources available in different parts of our province. But at the same time, we do have resources that are in the end of the our policy guidelines. So there's actually phone numbers and information there. But in terms of newcomers specifically, you know, I don't know of anyone that's that is just focused on newcomers, except actually our immigrant service organizations, where I think we have language capacity, where we sometimes play the role of interpreting certain information for workers. And of course, some of our organizations are to be identified there, our ISOs, our immigrant serving organizations. But again, my suggestion would be is to really take a look at the resources that are listed in this guide, and then, you know, dig deeper and perhaps even do some education or some, you know, some community educations if that's possible, but certainly education to the staff around the policy that gets developed.
Yeah, having those policies and procedures be as accessible as possible to as many people as possible is really in everyone's best interest. And so that would include, you know, making it easy to find that information, whether that's on your website or somewhere else. And also, you know, using plain language, using visuals, and that's not just going to benefit folks who are learning English or newcomers. It will really benefit all employees. So yeah, just encouraging those of you with the power to control such things to do so. And yeah, I think as much as possible, providing support to clients who may need help navigating their own workplace policies.
You mean workers? Yes, yeah, workers, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Ninu and Misha. We did receive, and I do want to acknowledge that we did receive a couple other questions, but we're unfortunately out of time for today, and I will be sharing those questions with our presenters and requesting a written feedback and sending the responses out to everyone. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for joining us today and for participating in the polls and taking part and submitting all of your questions. As well, I'd like to say thank you to our 4 presenters today for really sharing their knowledge and information with us. And we will be emailing all participants an online evaluation form. Please take the time to fill this out, as AMSA really does rely on the feedback provided in the evaluations to plan future events and trainings. And again, a special thank you to our speakers, Ludmila, Ninu, Misha, and Nina for sharing their time and their knowledge and experience with the settlement and integration sector. And I'd also like to say thank you to the AMSA team, Khan and on tech, Julie on providing tech support and questions, and Melissa on social media. And a notification will be sent out on SettlementNet once the webinar is available. And I will be sending out an email to everyone with all the different resources that were mentioned today during the webinar. So thank you so much. And once again, I'd like to say thank you to Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada for funding this event. Thank you for tuning in, and hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you. Bye-bye.